Social entrepreneurship has emerged as a popular model for those seeking to tackle social and environmental challenges by reimagining what business can be, not only as a vehicle for profit, but also as a tool for facilitating social change with the goal of improving the world. At its core, social entrepreneurship challenges the traditional divide between the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. It invites us to rethink what value is created, who benefits, and what it means to build an economy rooted in reciprocity rather than extraction. But the rise in social entrepreneurship's popularity requires us to pause for deeper reflection on how the model is used, who is included, and whether it's truly disrupting the systems it aims to transform or simply replicating them in more marketable ways. In this episode, we're pulling back the curtain on social entrepreneurship, not to dismiss its promise, but to grapple with its pitfalls and benefits. What does it really mean to build a business that centers social impact from the ground up? Who defines what social means in different cultural and economic contexts, especially across countries? And how do we move beyond heropreneurship towards models rooted in community, humility, and long-term systems change? This episode is a call to slow down, to listen more deeply, and to rethink the definitions, expectations, and power dynamics that shape the world of social enterprises. Because social enterprises don't succeed when they mirror the systems they seek to disrupt. They succeed when they reshape them. I am joined by Concepción Galdón, the Vice Dean of Business with Purpose at IE Business School in Spain and co-author of the book Promise, Pitfalls, and Potential of Social Entrepreneurship.
Thanks so much for having me. At present, I am the founder of a social enterprise called Puentes Global that I founded 15 years ago already. And I also run the Center for Social Innovation and Sustainability at our foundation.
Business for good can sound like a paradox, especially when we reconcile it with the fact that modern capitalist systems are rooted in exploitative models of extraction and profit maximization. Social entrepreneurs attempt to reimagine conventional business practices, creating models that are purpose-driven from the ground up.
I came across social entrepreneurship very much by chance. All my career, I knew I wanted to do something that was meaningful for me, that, if I don't assume I'm going to live forever. And so to me, the whole I'm going to work first and do something that matters later just doesn't make any sense. And that was clear in my mind. But initially, when I was younger, I always thought about it more like working for NGOs or international organizations, that kind of stuff. And I learned through experience that I don't have the right temperament for those. And so I had a little bit of an identity crisis when I went to do my master's programs. I was doing a master's in public administration and international development, very certain that I wanted to work in impact, but not really knowing what a person who's the only job I had enjoyed was in private sector, in banking. And I had tried NGOs and I had tried international organizations. I had interned for the United Nations before. So what does a private sector person do if they want to have an impact, right? And then after graduation, one of my professors got me in touch with a social entrepreneur who was working on a topic very close to the kinds of things I cared for. And so he wanted us to create a social venture together. And first thing he had to do was explain to me what that was about. And then I learned that you can have an impact through innovation, you can have an impact through business. And I've been in the verge of innovation, business, and impact ever since.
Hearing you reflect on your journey, you mentioned that traditional spaces like NGOs and large institutions didn't quite feel like the right fit, especially coming from a private sector background. Can you share a bit more about what felt misaligned for you personally in those environments?
There were two things for me. One was the mismatch between where the money is coming from and who the beneficiaries are, sometimes create some frictions. And also the kinds of spaces where I was working were very connected eventually to public administration. We needed public administration for us to be able to do our work. And that's just so slow. So surely there are other spaces where NGOs are more fast-paced, but not in the kind of space where I was working. And then it was the same in international organizations. The work they do is so important, but the pace of work is very much conditioned by the fact that they're populated by public administration people.
Many NGOs and international organizations are often weighed down by bureaucratic systems that make them incredibly slow to move. But beyond that, the public administration aspect means so much of how they operate is shaped by the political landscape, by who's in power, what priorities they hold, and also not to forget donor money and agendas which create their own set of challenges. It can feel like a constant cycle of putting out fires because you're always responding to the shifting agendas of whatever administration happens to be in charge or the likes of major donors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also there's good reasons why governments are slow, right? I'm not sure I want them to make decisions too quickly on taxpayers' money.
Social entrepreneurship has become a buzzword, used across sectors from universities, even offering dedicated tracks and programs around it. But beneath the buzz, there's a deeper question about what we actually mean when we say social entrepreneurship and what role it really is meant to serve.
So social entrepreneurship has become very popular. But of course, right, it's such an exciting space. And at the same time, you can die of success. So I think sometimes that social entrepreneurship might be falling victim of its own fans, which is not a bad problem to have, but it's important to name it once you have it and manage it. So social entrepreneurship in academia, there are very many different definitions. At a very broad sense, a social entrepreneur is someone who leverages innovative methodologies to cater to social and or environmental problems. So many times these methodologies that are innovative to the third sector come from the business world. And that is why often social entrepreneurship is understood as that hybrid space between the sectors.
Social entrepreneurship has generated a lot of enthusiasm, largely because it is seen as a promising improvement on the limitations of public, private, and nonprofit sectors. It takes many forms: public social enterprises, social businesses, cooperatives, entrepreneurial nonprofits, all aiming to tackle the shortcomings of traditional sector models. These include the public sector's lack of innovation, the private sector's narrow focus on profit, and the nonprofit sector's reliance on donations. Referred to as the four-failure theory by your co-author, Shayla Cannon, this framework helps explain the rise of social entrepreneurship as a hybrid approach to driving social change.
And even like the idea of the three sectors might be flawed in itself because you find so many hybrid organizations that you can't perfectly assign to one or the other. And so social entrepreneurship emerges as this interstitial space that is able to take and combine and mix innovatively different ways of doing from different sectors, and where the most important part of the definition is social enterprise is born to cater to a problem. So the impact is not a byproduct of its operation. The impact is the reason why it exists. Now, under that, you can have other subtypes, right, of definitions or other subtypes of social enterprises. So you can have for-profit social enterprises, you can have, which are often called social businesses, you can have social cooperatives, you can have entrepreneurial nonprofit. So it might be, pure nonprofit who starts catering to private sector to make some money, public social enterprise. So there are different types within the broader umbrella, all of which are so interesting. And the fact that such different realities can exist is precisely what makes social entrepreneurship such a powerful tool. So over getting too intense with, this is the real definition and anyone who's not doing this, is not a real social entrepreneur. And you get that sometimes. You get that sometimes in business school. The more prevalent definition has to do with for-profit social ventures. And you sometimes hear people, no, if it's not for-profit, then it's not a social enterprise because it's not even an enterprise to begin with. Well, who says so? And you get the same from other kinds where they're like, no, if it's for-profit, then by definition, it cannot be a social enterprise because how could it be social if it's for-profit? And again, it's like, well, that's your paradigm, right? And it's in the hybridity that we can find the beauty.
For social enterprises, impact isn't an afterthought. It's built into the very foundation of the initiative. It's the reason it exists. That's such a critical distinction, especially when we start thinking about how we design social enterprises and where the model can fall short. Because as much promise as social entrepreneurship holds, it also comes with pitfalls. For example, the tendency to replicate the very systems of inequality it seeks to challenge, may it be heropreneurship or the false belief that impact scales like profit.
When we started thinking about the book, it's precisely how often we run into these pitfalls that really drove us to writing the book. It was almost like a cathartic exercise after so many years in the center. We identified mostly 4 big pitfalls. One of them has to do with the human element in social entrepreneurship, the mental health of the social entrepreneur, and also the fact that entrepreneurs in general and social entrepreneurs in particular don't always make such incredible bosses and team managers. It's often not their main skill.
Heropreneurship, the idea of the lone visionary changemaker, is one of the most persistent narratives in social entrepreneurship. It centers individual charisma and personal sacrifice while often disregarding collective effort and community agency. While compelling for storytelling and fundraising, this narrative can obscure the realities of social impact work, which is rarely the product of a single leader and almost always rooted in collaboration, grassroots organizing, and long-term relationship building. Nonetheless, the issue of the heropreneur in many ways connects to so many of the broader pitfalls we see in this space.
The other important thing is, what does it mean for a social enterprise to scale? There's a big tendency to try to make a parallelism between social entrepreneurship and Silicon Valley-like, digital startups. And there's a debate there, do all social ventures or social enterprises need to be huge? Is the unicorn language even relevant at all in this space?
A unicorn is a privately held startup company valued at over $1 billion, often celebrated for its rapid growth and disruptive potential to the market. For example, OpenAI, Canva, Uber, Airbnb.
Another one is the obsession with impact measurement. Everybody talks about impact measurement. For a lot of social enterprises, it's a big problem because they don't have the resources, the impact investment funds. They force them into super complex measurement schemes that don't necessarily align with the real impact that they're trying to have. And everybody talks about impact measurement like it's this fantastic thing. And no one is really empathizing with, what is it that we're meant to measure? When we measure, what do we measure and what for? So that's the third pitfall. And the fourth pitfall has to do with our prior conversation, really, which was how do we embrace social entrepreneurship from all of the parts of the ecosystem? What is the enabling ecosystem? And how can we invite all of the parts to really engage with each other in the ecosystem? And we can have the business school types and the cooperative types and the third sector types, and everybody really find themselves at ease in this melting pot that social entrepreneurship is.
Defining the success and scalability of purpose-driven businesses through the same lens as traditional tech giants like Google or Meta, where success is tied to hypergrowth, IPOs, or acquisition, risks undermining the very essence of social enterprises. Impact doesn't scale like revenue. Social impact is complex, messy, and deeply rooted in context. Outcomes shift based on the environment, the community, and the specific challenges being addressed, making a one-size-fits-all measurement model both inadequate and potentially harmful. So, what is a social enterprise? The EU, for example, defines social enterprises in terms of democratic governance and inclusive participation. That raises important questions. What trade offs come with such a definition? And what can it teach us about building truly accountable and community centered models?
So that's actually a very good example. The EU includes this component because in our context, cooperatives are important and governance is very important. And that's an important cultural trait of our region. So it's not that it's mistaken or not. It's that it's very particular to a given place or to a given way of looking at what impact means.
Take the cooperative tradition, for example. If your social enterprise is structured as a co-op, it's almost inconceivable not to consider it inherently social or impact-driven because collective decision-making and shared ownership are baked into the very foundation. From that perspective, it's not just about what the enterprise does, but how it operates. If that is the paradigm you're working from, it fundamentally shapes how you define what social means in practice.
And of course, these governance structures are important. But for example, in that definition, they link that to potential profit limitation. And that begins to be a different animal because that begins to eliminate some types of social enterprises. And to me, that's problematic. I understand that that's the result of very, very, very many people having to agree. And so I really empathize with a group of people who had to write down that definition. And it's not the worldwide definition, it's the European Commission's one. So with all the empathy and recognition of the effort, it's a good example of how by coming to the conversation from your paradigm and being blind to the value of other people's paradigms and other people's cosmovisions, you sort of extricate yourself from them. And that's problematic.
The cooperative model is a particularly compelling example to interrogate, as it often is held up as the golden standard within the social enterprise landscape, a blueprint for democratic governance, shared ownership, and community-led decision-making. It reminds me of an example from a friend of mine who was running a social enterprise in Southeast Asia. And the community that she was working with didn't want to be involved in business decisions, which is a core feature of cooperatives. For them, the expectation was simple: show up, do meaningful work, get paid fairly, be treated with dignity, and then return home to their families. And that's valid. But when we start creating rigid definitions of what qualifies as a social enterprise, especially ones that require certain governance structures like cooperatives, we risk overlooking the importance of context. Cooperatives thrive in many parts of the world, South America, for example, but they're not a universal fit. Democratic participation in this case also means respecting that communities should have the agency to decide what engagement structure works best for them.
Absolutely. And different structures are means to ends. They're not ends in themselves. So sometimes, you turn your definition or your way of looking at the world without even noticing, right? But you turn it into an end in itself and just miss so much.
And I think this brings us to a crucial point, the question of whose voices are actually centered within these structures. Communities in the Global South are so often at the heart of social enterprise missions, yet they're frequently marginalized within the dominant paradigm that shape the field. There's a real disconnect between who these models claim to serve and who actually holds power in decision-making. So the challenge becomes, how do we shift the center of gravity? What would it look like to build a field where communities aren't just beneficiaries, but co-creators with agency, leadership, and ownership?
Not only that, communities in the global south are marginalized, and even in the global north, rural communities are marginalized versus urban areas because social entrepreneurship tends to accumulate around resources. It tends to be set up where the money is, and ecosystems are denser around urban areas. So when you go to regions that are more dispersed to begin with, creating an ecosystem that is really tightly bonded is more difficult just because of the sheer distance. Many of the cultures that are more prevalent in the global south are a little bit of a mismatch to prevalent ideas of what social entrepreneurship is about. And I think Hero Myth is a good example. The global south tends to have beautifully collectivist cultures who think of themselves as part of a bigger reality, which is the community. And they don't grow to detach themselves from the reality. They grow to always see themselves and identify themselves as part of the bigger community. In that context, this idea of, you are going to be this hero for the world, it just doesn't make sense. So on the one hand, it's a reality also in the global north that wherever there are fewer resources or less dense networks, it's more difficult for social entrepreneurship to emerge. And on the other hand, I think many of these pitfalls that we identify in the book are also more counterintuitive for the global south communities than they are in the global north. I think they are the result of northern-like obsessions.
Absolutely. That's such an important point. I've spoken about this before, both in previous talks and on this podcast. The way we conceptualize global development is so often rooted in a global north mindset. It tends to be individualistic, even isolationist at times, which stands in stark contrast to the more collectivist values found in many of the communities it claims to serve. What's especially concerning is how this mindset ends up creating hierarchies, elevating certain individuals as success stories, often in ways that don't reflect the community's own social structures or values. It imposes a framework that wasn't designed for these contexts. The heropreneurship model is deeply problematic, not only because it denies the agency of communities and elevates individuals in ways that reinforce inequitable power structures, but also because it sets up harmful, unsustainable expectations for the individuals themselves. When someone feels solely responsible for driving change or for the success of a social mission, it creates a dangerous environment all around. Systems change isn't a sprint. It's certainly not a solo mission. It's long-term work that can only be sustained through collective effort, shared responsibility, and a culture of care.
Mental health and burnout is a very real danger for social entrepreneurs. So the first victim of the heropreneur is the heropreneur, or the person who thinks that's who they should be. In the case of social entrepreneurs, this is combined with the fact that they deeply care for the topic they are working on. They are often personally connected to it, which makes them a lot more vulnerable to burnout. And that's very prevalent. So, for example, one of the social entrepreneurs we interviewed in the book, Catalina Escobar, she's the founder of Manpreet Foundation in Colombia. Their biggest operation is in Cartagena. And she lost a child. Even before that, she had really wanted to work to try to prevent infant poverty in Colombia. And after losing her child, she really strongly committed to helping the children of other women. And she realized that teenage maternity was a big, big way through which poverty prevailed, right? And was transferred from one generation to the other. So she committed to supporting teenage moms to try to avoid their childs from going through the same poverty cycle that they went through. And she has suffered so much, and she even went through depression. And was it not because of her team, and was it not because of her realization that it's not just me, it's all of these incredible people that are working on this matter together with me, she would have broken down. Solving an important matter like this one is not something that you do over a couple of years.
Absolutely. And I think a part of the heropreneurship model is this constant sense of urgency, the pressure to deliver fast, visible results. But the truth is, sustainable impact doesn't happen overnight. The systems that social entrepreneurs are trying to change, whether it's poverty, inequality, or environmental degradation, are all deeply entrenched. Meaningful change takes time, patience, and a long term view. And when we lose sight of that, we risk not only burning ourselves out, but also replicating the very systems of short term thinking we're trying to dismantle.
Absolutely. And that's about systems change, right? Also, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to change the system. It's not about planting 2 trees versus 2,000 trees. It's about regenerating the system so that you don't need to be planting trees anymore.
One of the things I often remind people is that a core challenge of heropreneurship is this belief that everything depends on me, the individual. There's a weight in that mindset. And while it comes from a place of passion and commitment, it's ultimately unsustainable. The kind of change social entrepreneurs are working towards, the kind that truly transforms communities, has to outlast any one individual. It has to be rooted in systems, not personalities. That means creating models that can endure leadership or organizational transitions without leaving communities abandoned. And that's what real sustainability looks like. It's not just about growth or visibility. It's about building something that can thrive and evolve long after you're gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, when we think about what does it mean that a social enterprise is successful, right? If you are a company, a normal for-profit company, a traditional company, success is clearly measured by your bottom line. And the traditional scaling up means I have one organization and my organization grows. And there's a very clear, directly correlation between my growth and my success. Now, when you move to the social entrepreneurship paradigm, maybe in your particular case, this first level of impact that has to do with scaling up. And it's more like, I want to grow the organization. But we identified 2 other ways of growing, which are what we call scaling out, which means maybe I can give my model to others for others to replicate. And there can be other organizations doing what I do rather than me grow. And this is especially relevant also if you're going to move to other communities or other geographies. Imagine that I have a really good model, and that model has developed in Latin America. And I do think that this can be good elsewhere. But maybe the way in which you implement this in places of Africa or places of Asia, maybe it's like 90% the same, but maybe 10% of it needs to be tweaked. And maybe a local organization that is working with teenage moms who's knowledgeable of what it means to be a teenage mom in Nairobi, for example, and why that comes about in Nairobi, which might be different to why that situation comes about in Colombia, takes your model. And so you are growing the impact, because as a social enterprise, it's not about growing the organization, it's about growing the impact. And the final goal is scaling wide, which is the systems change, which is when all organizations are doing things differently. Because, now the new normal that has been established has to do with something that you brought about. So now, the new normal for intervening with this kind of people, or the new normal for this kind of training with this kind of population is changed, right? And when that's the new normal, that's the ultimate success. And then no one cares for you, because everybody's doing what you were doing, or a version of what you were doing, and you're not needed any longer. So all models for scaling are important. All of them can have a role to play, but scaling up needs not be the holy grail of scaling your impact. A lot of social entrepreneurs feel this pressure to grow their organization, and they don't want to grow their organization. They just don't feel like that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I've wrestled with that myself. Even now in running Art of Citizenry, I feel that constant pressure, scale up, expand, grow. As an aside, in the years I have been working on the many iterations of Art of Citizenry, I've never considered calling it a social enterprise, though purpose has always been at its core. In reflection on our conversation so far, I suppose it likely fits that mold more than I've ever acknowledged. Going back to what I was mentioning earlier, that pressure to scale is incredibly consuming. It makes you question if what you're doing is worth it when you don't fit traditional paradigms of scalability success. That said, sometimes growth isn't the goal. Sometimes staying at a certain scale feels right, feels sustainable, and that's okay. The challenge is that our dominant models of success don't leave room for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are social entrepreneurs who want their organizations to grow. And that's great. They have the stamina, they have the team, they have the resources, or they're able to pull all of that together. And they're in a moment in their life in which they feel like they're going to push for it. And that's great. The problem is, if the paradigm is either you do that or you're a failure, my fear is we push a lot of small scale, very valuable projects too close. Because eventually you think, oh, well, I guess, I'm catering to 500 beneficiaries a year, and I'm being pushed to cater to, 500,000. And I don't want that. So I guess I'm not a real social entrepreneur. So I guess, this is ridiculous. I'll just close the operation. And that's such a pity, because you can also be a really cool catalyzer of bigger organizations who might incorporate your models. You can get impact through other means, other sources. And even if you are helping 500 people and those 500 people need you, why would you stop doing that? And, maybe in a different moment of your life, you'll choose to grow, or maybe you never choose to grow. It's not so much that it's bad that people focus on growth. Those who do should, because we do need social enterprises to grow. But that doesn't take away of the value of so many smaller projects that should take pride in what they're doing.
Absolutely. I would also argue that it's often the smaller, more localized projects that make the most direct impact precisely because they're deeply embedded in the communities they serve. They understand the nuance, the histories, the needs in ways that large-scale models often can't replicate. We've talked about how scale has become this dominant measure of success in the social enterprise space, but I think it's worth pausing to ask, what does responsible scaling actually look like? How do we grow impact without replicating the very power dynamics we're trying to undo?
The unfortunate question is, it depends, right? I think the responsible approach requires some reflection and requires thinking about what makes sense for this particular project, in this particular context, at this particular moment. And for some projects, at some moments, maybe collaborating with other organizations makes sense. Maybe scaling out makes sense. Maybe scaling up makes sense. So typically, projects first scale up as much as they can. How much they can depends. It depends on the resources they can get. It depends on the willingness of the team, including the founders, to take on all of that work and all of that risk. It depends on many things. But typically, projects, they scale up as much as they possibly can. They identify a tipping point where they're at the verge of breaking. And then if they are not surrounded by people who make their decision complicated, right, pointing them in the wrong direction, often they're like, okay, so now we're as big as we want to be, or as we want to be for now. But that doesn't mean we don't want to continue to grow our impact. So let's find other organizations with whom to collaborate. There's another social entrepreneur that we interviewed, Rodrigo Baggio. And Rodrigo started in Brazil a set of centers to educate younger people, but then all kinds of people in the use of technology. And they started growing a lot. And that was good. But at some point, he started thinking, I can't just grow this on my own. I can't grow it big enough. I need to find a different way of doing it. And he started doing social franchising, reaching out to other organizations for them to copy his model without having to pay for it. So that was a moment for scaling out. And then, he started thinking, well, I'd wish, the public administration incorporated this, so schools operated like this. And so maybe my next step is not so much, again, to grow my operation, but maybe to engage with public administrations. Because if I can make a minor change to the way in which public schools operate, then, that would affect very many children. And what is that tipping point where you feel like you've scaled enough? It depends. For some people, it might hit that wall really soon and then start thinking about collaborating with others really soon. And for the others, it might come later and you might grow a lot more and only then start thinking about collaboration. It really depends. And resources are not just money. Resources are also human talent and energy.
This gets me thinking about what it takes to build a truly healthy social entrepreneurship ecosystem. It's not just about individual founders or isolated success stories, but about the broader structures that support or limit this work. Whether we're talking about policy, funding models, or how we define and evaluate success, there's a lot that needs to shift. And one of the key questions we should be asking is, who is being left out? Because if the ecosystem isn't inclusive of the voices from the global south, of grassroots leaders, or those with lived experiences, the ultimate benefactors, then we're not building something sustainable or just. If you've tuned into the podcast before, you know that I strongly believe corporate self-regulation doesn't work. We need a strong system of checks and balances that requires engaging policymakers, civil society, and other stakeholders.
For the most part, most governments are missing from this conversation, or they participate very shyly because in most places in the world, public administration doesn't know very well how to engage with social enterprises because it's a new kind of animal. They know how to engage with companies, right? And that's as vendors. They have their policies about how to engage with private companies such that, it's not a corrupt thing. And when it comes to NGOs, they also have their structures and their ways of engaging with NGOs through subsidies, through donations, or by, subcontracting public services with them. But when they're in front of an animal that is maybe incorporated as a private company, but whose main work has to do with creating a social or environmental positive impact, a lot of public administrators, they just don't really know what channels. Do I funnel you through my private sector thingy? Do I funnel you through my NGO thingy? And if I don't have a funnel through it to channel you, is it going to be iffy? Is someone ever going to say that I was corrupt or I was misusing public money? Now in more and more countries, there are specific legal umbrellas for social enterprises, but government for the most part is an actor that's not very sure of what their place in this conversation could be. The other problem is also funders themselves.
One of the often overlooked challenges in the social entrepreneurship space is the complicated role impact investors can play. While their funding is meant to support mission-driven ventures, many still approach investment through a traditional lens, prioritizing returns and standardized metrics that don't always reflect the realities of social impact work. This creates real tensions, especially for small-scale social enterprises. These organizations may not scale rapidly or deliver neat quarterly outcomes, but that doesn't mean that their work is any less impactful. When investors bring rigid expectations around growth and measurement, it can force social enterprises to contort their models just to fit a mold that likely doesn't work within the context of the work that they actually do.
You get some funds saying that they're impact funds and that they want to do mostly impact, but then they ask social entrepreneurs to be growing and have financial results as if they were purely financial startups. And then what risk are you taking really? Because if you are saying that you want to support social entrepreneurs, but you're really evaluating them as if you were a financial investor.
One of the most persistent challenges social enterprises face is measuring impact. Unlike sales or cash flow, impact isn't a straightforward metric. It's often complex, slow to emerge, and deeply tied to social, cultural, and environmental contexts. A common challenge for social entrepreneurs engaging with impact investors is the expectation around metrics and reporting. Measuring impact takes capacity, both human and financial. Social impact is also often incredibly context-driven and nuanced. When impact investors expect standardized, quantifiable metrics to track success, it can place unrealistic pressure on social enterprises to deliver quick, easily measurable results that may not authentically reflect an organization's impact. This isn't isolated to social entrepreneurship. It is a common challenge across sectors, including international development. Reporting metrics on social change is not straightforward because the human experience isn't straightforward. And often the issues that social enterprises are looking to address are systemic, deeply embedded into social fabrics. These aren't issues that will get fixed overnight.
Social entrepreneurs that are so financially solid that they can go to these social impact funds, what they tell me over coffee, over a beer is, I just don't knock at the door of social impact funds. I'd much rather go to a financial investor. At least the conversation is clear. At least I know what it is that they need. And I have my own impact measurement system that works for me. If you're going to ask for the exact same results and you're going to enforce all of these other metrics on people, what is your real value? What is your value creation? And some add value, those that are more sector specific, because then they have like a lot of expertise in that sector. But if you're a generalist impact investment fund, you're investing in all kinds of things, and thus you are knowledgeable of none, and you are requiring at the same kind of financial performance that everybody else is requiring. And on top of that, social or environmental performance. Social entrepreneurs feel like, I'll just go elsewhere and at least I know what the game is.
I've had to think a lot about debt investment in the context of social entrepreneurship because it's such a common model in impact investing, but it can be incredibly tough on social enterprises because the burden of risk is disproportionately carried by the benefactor, not the investor. The terms are often rigid, with sometimes expectations to start repayment soon after receiving funds. That kind of pressure can be unrealistic, especially in sectors like the artisan economy. In these spaces, production can be seasonal. Artisans may shift between different types of work depending on the time of year. And on top of that, customer buying practices are incredibly seasonal. Trying to force that kind of ebb and flow into a traditional debt repayment schedule just doesn't work.
Absolutely, absolutely. All of us need to embrace all the different forms of social entrepreneurship and appreciate them for what they are. And this whole like, my way of doing things is superior and your way of doing things is less, like, this is not like a Miss contest, you know? It's like, it's real problems that we're trying to solve. And sometimes people want to feel so special, and so special they are that they detach themselves from everybody else.
Absolutely. It really feeds into this mindset of I'm doing it better than everyone else, or I figured it out. I have the secret formula. And that can be very dangerous. It ties back to what you mentioned earlier, the cultural lens that shapes how social entrepreneurs approach their work. Are they operating from a collectivist framework that values shared leadership and community voice? Or are they coming from a more individualistic, even isolationist perspective? It's not just about the communities they work with. It's also about the mindset they bring. That framing can fundamentally influence how they build, scale, and sustain their social enterprise.
I think also people don't realize how much whatever they've studied, for example, in undergrad, taints the way in which they look at the world. For example, you're graduating from business school, that is going to color the glasses through which you see the world. If you're graduating from an engineering school, that will color your glasses. If you're graduating from the school of philosophy or sociology, that is going to color your glasses. And just being conscious that that's the case. You chose that color. It's great that you can see the world through that color. You feel comfortable, but just be aware that those are the glasses that you're wearing and try to take them off every so often, not because they're not good glasses, but because it's good to understand that it's just the way you chose to see the world or the way in which you were taught to see the world, but does not give you any moral superiority over others who happen to see the world through another shade.
Recognizing the perspective, experiences, and trainings that shape our worldview and choosing to put that aside and listen to others is a powerful act of humility. It's how we make space for other ways of knowing and ultimately how we build more inclusive and responsive approaches to social change. It's such an important note to carry forward. How we build is just as important as what we build. So I'm curious, as you look ahead, what gives you hope?
Something that really gives me hope is to see social entrepreneurship having or making a system's impact in the very way in which we think about impact. And let me explain myself. So we tend to think that the impact of each social enterprise is in the specific topic that they're working on. But the other impact is proving that there are new, different, better ways to engage with different actors and to be impactful. And I'm very hopeful because I see different conversations emerging in different places. So for example, when I see big traditional NGOs begin to look at social entrepreneurship and think about, I'm curious about this. So maybe I want to incorporate a little bit of this way of doing things, or maybe I want to learn a little bit about how private sector does talent management. Because, maybe I don't want to be a for-profit company, but I could learn a little bit about the well-being strategies of big corporations, or maybe there's something I can learn about human-centered design because I've seen social entrepreneurs do this. And then public administrators, they don't know what to do with social entrepreneurs, but they're like, I'm curious about this. I see these sprouts of this curiosity sparkling in the three big sectors that social entrepreneurship is creating. And that gives me hope because, again, it's not about scaling up, not even about scaling up social entrepreneurship itself. It's about scaling wide. It's about changing the system. So if suddenly these other organizations that are very clearly set in their sectors can begin to be curious about each other and can begin to learn more of each other, that's really impactful. And that certainly gives me hope. The one thing that I'd like to stress is if you're curious about social entrepreneurship, so just open your mind and go for it and make sure to take pride on the process and learn and change and iterate and find the way in which it works for you and the people who might be, starting this venture with you and the community you're working with.
And I think listening is at the heart of it all. That's something I've been thinking a lot about throughout this conversation, how essential deep, intentional listening is to meaningful collaboration in social entrepreneurship. Collaboration is about growing together, being open to shifting your perspective, and co-creating with humility. It's through that kind of relational work that we can begin to challenge and reimagine the dominant models, or rather pitfalls.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. If what you're hearing from your community that you're trying to support, what you're hearing from the people you're working with, what you're hearing from yourself, generates an insight or an intuition that makes sense based on your context and that seems to not be aligned with whatever general narrative you're hearing, just forget the general narrative.
Reflecting on the strengths and pitfalls of social entrepreneurship, one thing is clear. Doing good cannot just be about good intentions. It has to be about shifting power. Real, lasting change doesn't come from chasing metrics defined by those far removed from the communities they claim to serve. It comes from listening, from building with, not for, communities, and from funding those already doing the work on the ground. If we want to talk about impact, we have to talk about who holds the mic, who gets the money, and who gets to define what success looks like. That means backing social entrepreneurs who are embedded in their communities, who understand the nuances. It's no coincidence that those furthest removed from the issues are often the ones with the greatest access to funding for their social enterprises. This reflects a deeper systemic problem where proximity to power and privilege, not proximity to the problem, determines who gets resources and who gets overlooked. Community-led systems change isn't a trend. It's the only path to a more just and equitable future. If we're truly serious about reimagining business for good, it's time to move beyond the myth of the lone change maker and start embracing systemic change as a collective, community-led effort. Real transformation doesn't hinge on individual heroes. It depends on redistributing power and deep listening. I would like to thank our guest, Concepción, for joining us today and sharing her insights. Conversations like these are important because they help us make space for alternative models. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music is by Katrina Zemrak.